Awesome. Good afternoon to all of you and those of you who are dialing in. My name is Rupal Shah and I am the Education Advisor at the Embassy of India. I have along with me today Lindsay Whitehead, who is both at Howard University and part of the Embassy of India Student Hub, as well as Tania Hope. Oh, Tania Navas, who made a Tania, I'm not sure. Tania Hope? Good, Tania Hope, who is the director of the Bunch Center at Howard University, who is co-sponsoring this event. So I'm gonna let both of them quickly introduce themselves before we talk about our exciting event on the power of nonviolent action with Dr. Helen Bond.
Thank you, Rupal. Hi, everyone. My name is Tania Hope, and I am the director of the Ralph J. Bunch International Affairs Center at Howard University. And we are so happy to be here today to co-host this event with our esteemed colleague, Dr. Helen Bond. But we're also very excited to be partnering with the Embassy of India for this particular conversation, and very much looking forward to continued collaboration with the Embassy of India in the coming academic year. We have some very interesting and exciting things that we are planning and maybe conspiring to pull together. So please stay tuned for that. And for those of you who don't know, the Bunch Center is the home of all things international at Howard University. We do global programming such as this. We also administer most of the study abroad for Howard University students and administer the Charles Rangel, Thomas Pickering, and Donald Payne International Fellowship programs that are efforts to diversify the Foreign Service of the United States. So you can follow us on social media, HU Bunch Center on Instagram and Twitter, and Ralph J. Bunch International Affairs Center -- Howard University on Facebook. And you can go to our website, global.howard.edu, sign up for our newsletter that comes out monthly, and stay up to date on all of the things that we have going on at the Bunch Center. So thank you all very much for being here, and I'm looking forward to this presentation.
Lindsay, you just want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindsay Whitehead. I'm a doctoral student at Howard University in the higher education and leadership program there. I'm so excited to be joining the Indian Embassy Student Hub and all the amazing work that they're doing. Just wanting to give a little bit of a format and overview of how the event is going to be structured for today. So we are going to have an outstanding 30-minute presentation by Dr. Helen Bond, followed by a Q&A session as well. So please, if you wouldn't mind just keeping your videos off for the presentation portion of the discussion, and then following up will allow individuals to put their videos on for the Q&A portion. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Rupal.
Thanks, Lindsay. And we're excited because this month we're celebrating not only Black History Month, but also a satyagraha that Gandhiji started almost exactly 100 years ago. So it's actually appropriate and exciting to introduce Dr. Helen Bond, who's a distinguished professor of education at Howard University. Professor Bond's also a Fulbright scholar and a member of the UNESCO Community of Practice in Peace Studies Curriculum Development. And my favorite line, she's the daughter of James Bond, and will bring some of the adventuresome spirit of all the James Bonds to speak about the power of nonviolent action that connects India and the United States through the larger life examples of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Bond, we're excited to have you. We look forward to your presentation.
And I'm very excited to be here. And thank you so much, Rupal. I want to send a special thanks to the Embassy of India Education Team and Student Hub. A special thank you to the Ralph Bunch Center at Howard University, and to a mentee of mine, student at Howard, a very special person, Miss Lindsay Whitehead. Thank you, and also thank you to our viewing and listening audience. Give me just a minute to share my screen, and we will get started. I'll see. Okay, perfect. Let's see here. Okay, we're going to be talking about today Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi, more respectively known as Gandhi Ji, and the intersections of their ideas as well as people. So I'm going to start with the slides here. If I can get them to move forward. There we go. The focus again is going to be the power of nonviolence. I do have what I call a table of contents to give us some sense of order, a bit of an introduction. A key question for me, I have to say, I found the research for this just absolutely invigorating. I discovered new connections and new ideas. And so I've got that framed in what I call a key or essential question. The primary focus will be the diffusion of people and ideas from India, as well as to America and the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, better known as the Black Freedom Struggle. I'll talk a little bit more about Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi Ji, some key aspects about that, but mostly focused around peace education and the power of nonviolence, not only nonviolence action, but nonviolent thinking. Here are our two key people that we are going to focus on. I have to share with you, in the United States, there's an organization that actually brings together scholars and activists each year around the power of nonviolent thinking and peace education, with Gandhi Ji at the center and Martin Luther King at the center as well. So we're going to be looking at the intersections of thought and people between these two very, very special key figures in our world today. Here's the key question. And as I was doing research for this, the key question really didn't emerge till I was halfway through the research on this. And it is, how did the ideas of Gandhi Ji travel 12,000 miles in the days of ocean voyages and propeller airplanes to play a role in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement? You know, it's commonly understood that, you know, Martin Luther King had heard about Gandhi Ji, had traveled to India, but we don't know really how those connections happen. And to really, I think, to understand the power of nonviolence, which Martin Luther King Jr. used in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, as well as others. He was what we might consider a central figure, but there are many other figures as well, as you will discover today. How did these ideas travel? What was the conduit for their traveling? And who were the people involved? And so that's our key question that's going to frame our discussion for today. Please keep your questions in mind. If I'm not able to answer it regarding Gandhi Ji and the movements there, I will forward those. I have my Indian colleagues that can help us with that. So, how did these ideas travel? We knew that King was aware of Gandhi's impact, Gandhi Ji's impact. I was doing some reading in the Stanford actually holds Martin Luther King papers, and plus a couple other places as well hold his actual words and papers. And when I was looking at some of his actual words, and I think it's best to use their own words to really, you know, explain their connection. It said that Martin Luther King always had an interest in Southern Asia, as he called it, the Orient. He spoke when he was in theological school. He had this theory of nonviolence that was actually shaping. He said that he thought he was the only one that, you know, there was another way to solve the problem of segregation versus an armed revolt. I'm paraphrasing bullet point 2. Martin Luther King was grounded in the Christian ethics of love, and he wanted to understand how it might solve social conflicts. And then he spoke about how he read Gandhi Ji's ethics of love as revealed in Jesus, but raised to a social strategy. But that's not, I mean, he had read about him, but there were other connections that really, when we go back to our central question, how did these ideas travel back and forth between the two countries? And this also lends light that there was great international force that played quite a bit in the US civil rights movement. And so we're going to look at how those forces came together. So he had read some of Gandhiji's work. He had this nonviolence sort of foundation built from his Christian ethic. And he says that Gandhiji helped us to understand, and for this we are grateful a decade after his death. But now, so I'm going to share how Martin Luther King did travel, although we're going to look at what was the conduit for these ideas. Picture here showing him removing his shoes before entering Gandhiji's shrine in New Delhi, India in 1959. There's a picture there with him with his wife Coretta King in India in 1959. But before he got there, and that's where we're going to be going in this, so you can have some anticipation. King did indeed travel to there in 1955 on behalf of wanting to better connect with Gandhiji's ideas. However, he was not the first. He was really not the critical conduit that brought these ideas and this momentum of the power of nonviolence together. In fact, I'm going to go back to that slide. Sorry, I moved it back a bit there. He wasn't the first person. Actually, there was contact as far back between India's movement with Gandhiji, as far back really as Booker T. Washington. Howard Thurman is really one of the key connectors, as well as Gandhiji. I'll show you how he had actually reached out and was in contact with key movement leaders. So when we think of the diffusion of ideas, we think of Martin Luther King went to India to connect with the power of nonviolence, when in fact, the person, and I was doing some research on Howard Thurman, described as Daytona's most forgotten man. And he born in 1894, died in 1984, and he's written a book where he describes how influential the ideas about leadership and about the marginalized. And he actually took an entire group of people, I think it was about 4 or 5, to India to connect and to learn more about the particular movement. And I have some things I want to read about him. I'm going to see here. Yeah, I was going to pull the screen down a little bit, but I think it might be a little too, we'll leave it in this mode. More than a century ago, and his story is just absolutely amazing. And because when I talk about the diffusion of people and ideas, I wanted to give people a sense of what was happening during this time period and a little bit about the people and how they had this sense of nonviolence through their own life. Howard Thurman is the grandson of slaves, and he was born in segregated Daytona, Florida. He actually lived, here's this picture again. I'm going to go back to the facts. He was actually born in a all-Black town. I'm actually doing some research around all-Black towns called Waycross, Florida. He was very close to his grandmother after his father died. His father died of pneumonia, and he was able to go to school for a few years in that area. And then there were no more schools that Black children could go to at that time. He always had a desire for education. His grandmother used to read him the Bible all the time, and he was very, very religiously based. And I think that was part of his draw to find out more about these principles of nonviolence. But an interesting story I wanted to share. He wanted to finish his education, and there was a school further north in Jacksonville, Florida. And so he boarded a train, mainly the only mode of mass transport at the time. But at the time, his parents didn't have or either they didn't have enough money or they didn't give him enough money to ship his bags. And so he writes about this later in his autobiography. It was just really amazing that he was found crying at the train station. And even though I have just a brief line about how a Black man, a stranger, covered the bill for him, actually he describes it as a man approaching him in overalls. He really doesn't even hardly remember his face other than he was a Black man. He just appeared, sort of. He just walked up to him, gave him money, and then simply walked away. Just a wonderful story. In the resource section at the end, I have some books that you can follow up with. Howard Thurman, considered one of the most forgotten men in Daytona, Florida. When I do presentations like this, I really like to draw in the figures so you can get a feel for the movement as well. And years later, he actually writes about this in his life story, that the stranger really restored his broken dream. He never forgotten about that incident, and he refers to it often. But Howard Thurman, now this is a little bit about his growing up, but I'm going to take it further now. I'm going to move this over so I can see my writing a little bit better. I wanted to capture some of the things that he actually felt. Here's a picture of him in India with his wife. And he describes that Gandhi's philosophy and practice of how he understands it as a soul force, uh, had an impact on him. And there's also a connection where his thinking actually crosses path with some of the others, as well as with Martin Luther King. Thurman and King's father, an Atlanta minister, were friends when the young King was actually growing up. So you have Thurman crying at the train station, eventually becoming educated. There's also a Howard connection here, as well as another Atlanta connection. Was a friend with King's father. Martin Luther King describes remembering Thurman in the household, talking about these ideas. Remember our key question about the diffusion of ideas and people between two continents. This is a connection with King's father, Thurman going to India to meet with Gandhi ji, and some more ideas about Howard Thurman and how his life not only bridged ideas, but also bridged eras that connected with Martin Luther King. Keep in mind, he was a grandson of slaves. He actually rode in a horse and buggy. I think it's good to make you realize the context in which these profusion or diffusion of ideas was actually taking place. The year he died, the IBM personal computer was born. Dean of the Rankin Chapel at Howard University and Dean of Marshall Chapel at Boston University. Boston writes a little bit about him. But Howard Thurman is considered in the writings. Now, when you look at the writings more broadly, you see a little bit of difference there, but generally he's considered in the writings as the first African American to actually go to India and connect with Gandhi ji and his writings here to there. So he's considered one of the original bridges, the bridge, but there were other bridges. I wanted to do a wrap-up slide here on Thurman. His influence on King Jr. was critical in shaping the civil rights struggle, deeply influenced by Gandhiji's use of nonviolence and India's struggle for independence from British rule. In 1936, he led a 4-member delegation and traveled throughout, known as the Pilgrimage of Friendship. And James Farmer, if you remember, I believe I don't know, he wasn't on that delegation. It was Tobias, a gentleman that was very much so involved in the civil rights movement or the Black freedom struggle at that time. Wasn't known as the civil rights movement yet. But it was during this visit that he would meet Gandhi ji, who at the time was leading the nonviolent struggle. And so this was a critical piece in bringing together those key actors in the diffusion of ideas. But we have someone else. Um, again, we think of Martin Luther King Jr. going to India and learning about the nonviolent struggle. But now we've learned that Howard Thurman played a role, but also who played even a more closely, Thurman's, knew Martin Luther King's father. Martin Luther King was a child listening to them talking. But now you have a closer connection with Benjamin E. Mays, 1894, I believe that's 1991. So before the emergence of King going to India, you have this son of slaves, born in 1895 in a town. This gives you a contextualization of the the context in which these ideas and actors were actually born in. Born in 1895. We have a discrepancy there between 1894 and 1895. Actually, the text, when you look up his birth date, they'll say 1894 or 1895 circa, because births weren't recorded as strictly and directly as they are now. But in a town called 96, a small town in South Carolina. And so I was doing some research last night because I had never heard of a town called 96. Interesting story there. So for those of you that are listening that would like to continue the research, continuing understanding this a little bit more, here's some great things that you can continue to look at. And no one really knows why or how the town came to be known as 96. It's actually in Greenwood County, South Carolina. But they do think that along the road to a Cherokee, major Cherokee holding, by the time you got to this area in Greenwood County, South Carolina, it was 96 miles to the Cherokee sort of capital at that time. And so that's one idea about how that became known as 96. Interesting story behind that. But again, going back to the diffusion of ideas, Benjamin E. Mays did travel to India, first dean of the School of Religion at Howard University. So you see, Howard University is one of those places that actually helped diffuse some of these ideas around nonviolence. Uh, um, you see Howard Thurman being there now, Benjamin E. Mays, and if you know anything about him, he actually later on became um, president of Morehouse College. He's actually buried there, but he was born in this small town. And let me say a few more things about that. That's a story on his own. So I invite you to go to his autobiography. But he had quite an upbringing. His mother was very supportive of his educational pursuits. Much of a similar story. It reminded me of Thurman's upbringing. Very close to his mother. Mother encouraged, had a traumatic kind of relationship with his father, who wanted him to stay home to sort of work in the fields there. They had a rural upbringing. He didn't do that. And his father was nearly, just as a quick follow up, his father was nearly killed in what we call the Phoenix riot, not Phoenix, Arizona. This actually happened in Greenwood County, South Carolina, where 96 is the town of 96 is a part of that. And I'll let you read more about that. But it gives you some sense. You have to, I feel, you have to understand a little bit about the roots of these individuals to get a sense of why they were drawn to this power of nonviolent thinking, nonviolent action. And although that idea diffused in different ways, it looks a little different the way it was implemented in America and the U.S. Civil Rights Movement versus the way it was implemented maybe, in India. And we know that Gandhi Ji went on to South Africa and did some wonderful things, was in London and back and forth. But the power of this concept was very strong. And you really have to understand the roots of these individuals that really were the bridges. We think of Martin Luther King associated with Gandhi Ji, but you have these powerful individuals before that. And so Benjamin Mays is growing up in turmoil, really kind of with his father. His father was nearly killed in this Phoenix riot. It was actually the the Southern Democrats at the time and about Black votes. You'll have to read about that. I wish there was time to tell that story because it really, he writes about that. He refers to that quite a bit in his autobiography, a very shaping event. So, but he was eventually was able to be educated. He traveled to India in 1936, where he actually describes in his autobiography that he spoke at some length with Mahatma Gandhi, Gandhi Ji. He was a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. As you know, Benjamin Mays was the president of Morehouse. Martin Luther King Jr. actually went to Morehouse. And so those ideas not only diffused from this growing up, leaving one's place, getting educated. We see Howard as a place of diffusion for these ideas. Now we're seeing that so was Morehouse College. And Martin Luther King was there and they were able to interact there. Great story. I invite you to read. The title of his book is Born to Rebel, an autobiography. What a great story. But here's the part I didn't know. It was just really intriguing. And I uncovered so many more things that I'd like to research because when you go back and you really start digging deeply, you uncover all these different ways in which you could look at it. I did discover that Gandhi had been in contact, Gandhi Ji, more respectively, had been in contact with key religious leaders. I did not know this. It was a complete surprise, very interesting. I'm still learning more about it. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions, but we know that he had an admiration for Booker T. Washington. You know anything about Booker T. Washington? He was the key founder, organizer, fundraiser, developer of the great Tuskegee Institute. I have a cousin actually that's a professor down at Tuskegee University now. But we know that, when I put them together on the, typically people think about him as being in controversy with W.B.E. Du Bois' ideas. Actually, there were more similarity than there were actually difference. But the key thing here is that Gandhi had been in contact, so much so that he had contacted W.E.B. Du Bois, educated in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, went to Harvard, a very different lifestyle, I think, and upbringing than Booker T. Washington, coming up from West Virginia, very, very poor upbringing. But Gandhi contacts W.E.B. Du Bois, and he wants to print an article in The Crisis. If you know anything about The Crisis, I'm going to go to the next page now. The Crisis was part of the magazine that was printed by the NAACP. So we know in my research, I literally just uncovered it in the last couple of days. In 1929, Gandhi had written a message to the American Negro addressed to Du Bois and published in The Crisis. And what a wonderful, and I would like for him to speak in his own words because they are so elegant and so poignant. And they were published. Gandhi Ji wrote, "Let not the 12 million Negroes be ashamed of the fact that they are the grandchildren of slaves. No dishonor in being slaves. There is a dishonor in being slave owners." What a powerful message. But let us not think of honor or dishonor in connection with the past. Let us realize, and I love this last line, of looking to the future. And what a poignant message there. I'll be sharing these slides with you. You can actually learn more about that connection. But when we go back to our essential question, how did the ideas travel? Who did they travel with? What were the key places that they diffused? And come to find out that Gandhi Ji had already reached out, was aware of some of the Black freedom struggles during Du Bois' time. The U.S. Civil Rights Movement had fomented, but it was certainly building in what we call the long view of the Civil Rights Movement or the Black freedom struggle. Really incredible finding there that I plan to do some more research. Gandhi Ji and King Jr. I love to use their own words. this notion of nonviolence being founded within a religious, a Christian doctrine. I'm going to move on a little bit. So who was Gandhiji? Had reached out, former lawyer who led, here's a young picture of him and a older picture, former lawyer who led civil disobedience against colonial policies, encouraged Indians to boycott British goods, and had served 2 years in prison on charges of sedition. His philosophy of Satyagraha, which sought to reveal truth, and sometimes that's understood on the African American and in the US civil rights movement as this, what they call the soul force or the truth force. But it sought to reveal truth and confront injustice through nonviolence, had made him a polarizing figure on the subcontinent. While the British regarded him with suspicion, he was really regarded, the term of Mahatma, or great soul, a really, really interesting figure. And I did a Fulbright Nero, a scholar through the Fulbright program in India several years ago, and had a chance to travel and through southern India, and realized the great respect on there for Gandhi ji. And here's a picture of him younger with his wife, because it's really good to sort of see them in more of, we often think of the figures as they are in their political movements, but they were people, they were young, they had lives. And so I wanted to explore a little bit of that as well. I really love that picture there. But to really capture, and I'm thinking, what a history. And so much to look at there. But somehow the Salt March, it really captured it. I'd always been really, I was just captured by this movement. Sometimes it's described as the tax revolt that changed history. But it was so much more than that. What I see in that for our presentation today is this act of civil disobedience that was, that was so motivating to others. It took place from March to April 1930 in India. This great act of civil disobedience led by Gandhiji to protest British rule in India. And you have to, and I've got some resources at the end to actually learn more about the Salt March, how the British, controlled that trade of that essential mineral until they controlled all the finances around that, the ability to extract salt, and they taxed users of that. But during the march, thousands of Indians followed Gandhiji some 240 miles, resulted in, when I was reading about it, it really reminded me of some of the movements, marches of Martin Luther King. But the march resulted in the arrest of nearly 60,000 people, including Gandhiji himself. India was finally granted independence in 1947. Lots of things happened in between that. And when I like to describe a figure using their own words, it's and I found this quote, and I thought this really captures what we call this power of nonviolence and diffusion of ideas. 1920 article, The Doctrine of the Sword. I do believe, and I chose this because both Gandhiji and Martin Luther King were complex figures, and in some ways controversial. And it's important to recognize that, because we often have characters of people, the way we think about them, and we don't think about them and appreciate them in their fullness. He writes, I do believe that when there is only a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence. I would rather have India resort to arms in order to defend her honor than that she, in a cowardly manner, become a helpless victim to her own dishonor. But more importantly, he writes, but I believe that nonviolence is infinitely superior to violence. Forgiveness is more manly than punishment. Let me not be misunderstood. And I really like the way he foments his understanding of this. Strength does not come from physical capacity. It comes from indomitable will. Young India, 1920. You can get a sense of that, why that thinking and writing and Gandhi ji as a person would be so attractive, his philosophy to the US civil rights movement. I'm going to share now of I'm I do a lot of research in peace education and how I have known Gandhi and a part of Gandhi ji's experience that is often overlooked. Uh, on the right, well, my right, it might, you're coming from a different angle there, but you see Maria Montessori. No one really remembers or connects Gandhi ji with Maria Montessori. That is a tidbit of this that is somehow forgotten when we talk about the diffusion of ideas, because we've been talking about the power of nonviolence. We've been talking about people growing up in bad circumstances, moving on to lead great movements. But there was also another movement in between at that happening at that same time. And that was really fomenting this notion of peace education. And we attribute this great quote and by to Gandhi ji, and it was indeed his quote. But it took place. He met Montessori in October 1931. This is a picture of him in East London, and you can see how renowned he can barely, get out of the automobile. He is so surrounded by onlookers and admirers. But he had met Marie Montessori just a little bit before this. And he spoke at the Montessori Training College in London. If you know anything about Maria Montessori, uh, you know, she's actually a doctor. A lot of people forget that. But she was also a great educator, a great believer in education that was not that more focused on the development of the child versus the development of the curriculum and standards. She believed in looking at the whole child, and a lot of her ideas have sprang forth. And now you know about Montessori early childhood programs and school programs. There's a great history there. But both of these people were great believers in peace education for children. And so that's a connection where I've always appreciated, but I think it's been underappreciated worldwide. I want to share a bit of Gandhi ji's speech while he was at the Montessori Training College in London. And Maria Montessori, of course, was there. Uh, we know this, and it's good to always source your material as since we, with students here, a young Indian, November 19, 1931, recorded this. And typically we know, I've highlighted in red the quote that typically is ascribed to Gandhi ji without the fullness of the wonderful message. And he says, "You have very truly remarked," referring to Maria Montessori, that if we are to reach real peace in this world, and if we are to carry on a real war against war, not in a violent way, he's referring to a resistance, we shall have to, or peace education rather, we shall have to begin with children. And so, and let me finish, and I'll paraphrase just a bit in essence for time. If they can grow up in their natural innocence, we won't have to struggle. We won't have to pass fruitless, idle resolutions. We shall go from love to love and peace to peace until at last all the corner of the world are covered with that peace and love for which consciously or unconsciously the whole world is hungry. What a beautiful message. Often when we see that quote, and you see it a lot, it's truncated to simply say, if you want to reach real peace in this world, you shall have to begin with children. And actually, when I presented at the Gandhi King Conference in the United States, my presentation was entitled Making Peace with Children. And I used some of the work of Gandhi ji and Maria Montessori in this way. Beautiful quote, a beautiful attribution here to this understanding of nonviolence in that, the importance of peace education and beginning with children. And I just think it's a remarkable piece of the story. We've gone over, we just have another few minutes and we're going to open it up for questions. We've looked at the diffusion of ideas, how they crossed the water, how they were in people, how they were mixed and shared and diffused in institutions. Now I want to look at this notion of nonviolence. I won't read all of this because I'm going to share with this, but a very, very strong um, idea that's been sort of diffused and understood in different ways. I'll just read you just snippets of it here, and certainly you can read it on your own. But the piece that I really like is this understanding of refusing to meet violence with violence. And if you know anything about the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, the people that were in that movement were actually trained to sit at lunch counters and take the beatings and the slurs and whatever people did to them, not in the ways that they were cowards or in any way, but as this philosophy is described, as participants in a nonviolent campaign, you refuse to reciprocate the violence against you. And then the attacker becomes shaken by the sight of the suffering. This is some of the sort of philosophical undergirdings, if I might say, or foundation of the power of nonviolence. The adversary becomes unsure of how to respond, and you gain the sympathies of the police or the troops or the people around you as cruelties to nonviolent people increase. Then this fomenting of resistance against the people that are enacting the violence. So just a little bit about the philosophical underpinnings of that. What I found interesting, and we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, I've given you the source if you are interested, but I didn't know this. I didn't know that this notion of moral jujitsu coming from Japan was actually also connoted or understood as the power of nonviolence. And it's just amazing. Gene Sharp in The Politics of Nonviolent Action writes about it. Gandhi Ji depicts it as what happens when a man violently strikes water with a sword. The man's arm is dislocated and the water is unhurt. The use of brutality against a nonviolent group, rather than breaking the group's determination, it actually strengthens the group. There's a missing term there. I'll correct that before I share that with you. But this notion of moral jujitsu, extremely interesting. And traced to Buddhist monks in India. Jiu-jitsu it's written in another way, as you can see on the screen, but its modern form actually comes from Japan. A really this understanding of this diffusion of this notion, and it just gives you aspects of how they incorporate this notion in this jiu-jitsu. Conduct is new, unexpected, unpredictable to the person habituated by violence. Self-control, lack of anger, conserves energy. I'm paraphrasing. You can read more about this. The victim's refusal to use violence indicates his respect actually for his assailant. I mean, just incredible, important ideas there. The respect shown by the nonviolent resistor gradually tends to put his attacker really off guard and to shame. So that's, you can read more about that. That's a connection that I think is certainly worth exploring. Extremely important. We're going to wrap up here. The King Center identifies 6 steps for nonviolent social change based on Dr. King's teachings. Principle 1, nonviolence as a way of life, as a philosophy. Principle 2, a way to win friendship and understanding, to show empathy. Principle 3, it's a way to seek to defeat injustice, not people. The enemy is injustice, not another person or group. Really wonderful ideas diffused. Principle 4 holds that nonviolence, that suffering for a cause can educate and transform people and societies. And it did. We've seen examples of that. Principle 5, nonviolence believe that the universe is on the side of justice. And you've heard Martin Luther King Jr. saying, the arc of the moral universe is long. I know I can't hear you saying it, but you probably know the rest of that. But it bends toward, you're right, justice. Beautiful saying there. But that saying is founded on this notion of nonviolence. Nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, again, not people. And you can read more about this. Martin Luther King Jr. and his observers and advocates have written a lot about it. 6 steps, getting the information What are the facts? Educating oneself, having a personal commitment to nonviolence, negotiation and compromise. This notion of personal commitment, again, probably a repeat there. This notion of direct action, focusing on voting and applying those nonviolent principles in a direct way toward that particular issue, and this notion of reconciliation. We're going to wrap up here. Two heroes of nonviolence resistance. Gandhi Ji, movement to expel the British from India through nonviolent resistance. It refers to violence, also the violence caused by poverty, colonialism, and caste. Martin Luther King, symbolic leader of the American Civil Rights Movement, used nonviolent struggle as a form of social protection and mobilization for legal reform. As we wrap up, I was reading late last night about Gandhi's death. It was horrific, and I was reading. I knew quite a bit about Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. He died April 1968, killed on a balcony, second floor room in the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. And Gandhi's death came less than a year after India gained its independence. Gandhi was on his way to daily prayer, was shot actually 3 times on January 1948. Even though we have lost in bodily form these great figures, but the power of their messages, as what's encased in the circle on the slide, nonviolence and messages of freedom, has continued with us. We may have lost the men, but we have their ideas. They're widely diffused and respected. I want to end, I've got a resource page I just want to briefly go over. But before we end, in reverence to Black History Month, and we are on the cusp of March, which is Women's History Month. So in lieu of both of those, I wanted to leave you with some books about the people of the movement. We have The Radical King, which really it's a sort of, they build on his notion of nonviolence as really a radical notion, not that he was necessarily radical. We have a wonderful book. I really like this one, The Essential Gandhi. He has a lot of his writings and his vision. We have a book about visions of a better world, about Howard Thurman, just an incredible story there. The book about Benjamin Mays, how he interacted, president of Morehouse, interacted with Martin Luther King. Remember Howard Thurman's father knew Martin Luther King's father. And I won't go because we're getting with our time here a little bit. But I wanted to include, because the same as in the India movement as in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, there's lots of people that have played a role that we have not had a chance to mention. And I wanted to include some of those. We have Ella Baker, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Maggie Lena Walker. So I wanted to include that for you as we approach Women's History Month. And certainly I don't want to forget our new Vice President, Howard graduate, Kamala Harris, in The Truth We Hold, wonderful book there. Here are a few resources. I think I'll maybe add some more. You can learn a little bit more about the wonderful Salt March speech made by Gandhi Ji, overview of King's trip, and some more information. So I am going to end that. I know I took up too much time, but it was such a great story, so many wonderful connections. I thank you for being such great listeners, and I'm looking forward to your questions. So thank you very much.
So I was officially the timekeeper, but I didn't.
Oh, and I'm way over time.
No, but I didn't choose to exercise that because that was an incredible presentation. And just this idea of diffusion is incredibly powerful. So I just want to say thank you as Lindsay takes on the questions. So thank you so very much. And don't worry about the time. It was well spent.
Oh, thank you. Apologize for going over.
I just want to reiterate what Rupal has said. That presentation was absolutely phenomenal, Dr. Bond, and we're so appreciative of just that well articulated and in-depth presentation. There was so much information, so robust, so many things that I wasn't even aware of myself. So thank you so much for that. Want to dive deeper into some of the questions here. Was hoping that you could maybe unpack for us a little bit more. What does it really mean, this whole aspect of diffusion of ideas? Could you unpack what that means a little bit more for us?
Thank you. That's a great question.
And
And
Ted,
that,
do you want to take a moment and get a glass of water? I'm feeling a little bad for you that we have you sort of
uh,
captive over here. So
well,
you want to
no,
take a
that's
second?
okay. In
Okay.
respect of time, because I don't want to lose
Okay.
anyone.
Okay. No worries.
Yeah, I think I will take a little. That's such a powerful question because that didn't really come to me, this notion of this diffusion of ideas, because I was approaching this in a linear way. I was thinking that, Martin Luther King grounded in his Christian, ethics. And that was his interest. I knew he had read some of Gandhiji's writings, but I didn't know that how powerful that Gandhiji had actually reached back and was sharing his ideas on the struggles here. I didn't know about that awareness. I discovered that as I was looking through the documents. And then I dug a little bit further, and then you had Thurman and you had others, reading those writings, being aware of what's going on, in another country in India's struggle. And so they were sharing ideas. And so this notion of nonviolence didn't strictly come from Martin Luther King's reading or his desire to travel to India or what he had heard about Gandhiji. It was this great understanding and this mixing of people and ideas. Because if you think about W. Du Bois had some interaction with Howard, but you had Thurman that was there. You had Benjamin Mays that was at Howard. Then you had these figures that were, interacting with Martin Luther King's father, sharing ideas, talking. They were both at Morehouse. So it was just amazing the interconnections that were made there. It was just really incredible. And so that was a surprising finding for me, but not too surprising because ideas do like that travel and they come together. And so thanks for that question. I could say a lot more about it, but that was an unexpected finding for me, but very pleased.
Could you speak a little bit more about the women? I think I was grateful to hear you talk about Marie Montessori, but even some of the pictures in the last slide of all the books of Ella Baker. So talk about some of the women in this diffusion of ideas in the power of nonviolence.
Thank you, Paul, for that really important question because I do textbook analysis, just a little bit of side, and I've seen, and we think of the U.S. civil rights movement, and often the way it's portrayed in textbooks, you can get a sense of how it's being diffused in society. But we often think of it as Martin Luther King and you can add that Rosa Parks, but there were all these wonderful key figures in between. And Ida B. Wells, which is, and I actually had 2 books on Ida B., which is just an absolute favorite hero of mine. And she was critical, based out of, and her young story as a child is absolutely incredible. A lot of brothers and sisters, parents had died. She actually had to take over and raise her brothers and sisters. But she was key in the fight for lynching. She was a journalist, but she was a feminist at that time. And she would write about, a man was lynched today, a woman was lynched today. And she was key in bringing that information. She was threatened. She had to leave Memphis. There were actually 2 store owners there that owned a store that was doing quite well. They were actually lynched. She was very close to those 2 people. She wrote about it, and she was told that she had better be out of town by midnight. She was called a filthy mulatress. Just amazing, when you pull the language and you look at these people in their own lives and words. But, as she went on in the struggle and the Niagara movement came and they developed the NAACP, she really wasn't given credit. And she heard about that. And she actually made mention in her writings. She says, I was saddened that I wasn't included when they talked about lynching and how the, and and how journalism and writing about it really helped to attract attention. And she says, I wasn't included in that story. And she was a very powerful figure because one of the things that she did mention, she says toward the end of her life, as she looked back over the struggle, she says, if I could take my people up in my arms and ascend with them into heaven, I would do so. Just a powerful, powerful figure. And so I don't think, and that's the reason I really love your question. I appreciate it so much. We don't hear enough about the women in these struggles. The women are really, a lot of times, really invisible. And I wanted to highlight that. And, a thumb up for Fannie Lou Hamer. A lot of people don't know. We hear about this notion of the piggy bank. She actually had a pig bank. People are, it's a wonderful, wonderful story. I wish I had more time to tell it. Owned a piece of land, a lot of land actually as a cooperative, invited other poor freed men and women and African Americans to farm there. And really, when they needed money for things, didn't necessarily have the cash, but they could garner pigs. And so if you needed cash, then you would go to literally the pig bank and just a wonderful story. I mean, I just can't, I wish I could, had was invited somewhere to do one just on the women of the movement because I'm quite passionate about their stories. And so, and that's the reason I wanted to add those books so we could, make this, Black History Month, but Women's History Month is stories yet to be told. So I appreciate all of you, and I know we're right at the 2:00 hour. And
I think we might have time if there's one more question. If you're okay,
sure,
let's try
absolutely.
one, see if anybody has one more question. Otherwise, we'll call it on time and definitely invite you back for another conversation because you
Thank
are an
you.
incredible storyteller and it's really, really great an opportunity to learn from you. So hang on, let me see if anybody has one because I, of course, always have another one. Lindsay, I'm going to give you the honor. You said you too, so how about you have the last question and you close it out.
Well, Dr. Bond, we talked about this importance of like nonviolence, the struggle for freedom here in the United States, and then also thinking about the power of nonviolence in India. Could you maybe speak to a little bit like what was that connecting theme between the two, and why do you think the power of nonviolence is so powerful?
Oh, wow. What a perfect closing question, Lindsay. It really is. You know, and I'd like to say this, that book is still being written because that idea is so powerful. It's understood and lived in differently in different contexts, but it's just rooted. I mean, another connection that I didn't know. I didn't know that it was connected to this notion in Japan of moral jujitsu. No idea. But it is such a powerful message. And I think that is a message that foments peace education. And I think it's despite your religious background or connotation, I believe the basics of that is found in all of religions. And of course, a lot of times religion isn't just religion, it's a lived experience. And so, and I believe in the lived experience of Gandhi Ji, Martin Luther King, and all these. I think they lived this feeling of nonviolence. And that's the reason I wanted to add things about their background and the context of their life. It was just so powerful. But that question is within itself really a book to be written and an article. Why does that still resonate? We live in a world of violence, whether it's physical violence or poverty, or hunger. But this notion of peace and nonviolence has persisted, within all of that. So what a great way to end. What a wonderful session today. Thank you.
I just wanted, on behalf of the Embassy of India, the India Student Hub, and I'm sure the Bunch Center, really want to say thank you. It's an incredible way to think about our interconnections and sort of this diffusion of idea principle that shows, I think, especially the way you just said it at the end, how it's a lived experience, right, that we sort of share across humanity. So, Dr. Bond, honored again, and thank you. Tania?
Thank you.
Oh, that was fantastic. I loved those stories, and my mind is racing now. We probably need to have a follow-up conversation about some of the things you just shared. But I'll save that for another time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Tania, for being a conduit and hosting us. We much appreciate your wonderful work at the Ralph Bunche Center. And Lindsay, to you, you wonderful graduate student, you have a wonderful future ahead of you. In any way I can support that, I'm happy to do so. Thank you for bringing this together.